On the morning of August 7th, 1944, outside a nameless French village that had already changed hands twice, a Sherman called Lucky 7 ran out of luck. At least, that's what the math said. The math said that when a 75mm shell from a Panzer IV hits the front of a Sherman at 800 yards, the American tank dies in one of three ways. 1. The armor cracks, the shell punches through, and everything inside turns into hot metal and human noise. 2. The shell glances, dives lower, and rips through the thinner plate over the driver and bow gunner. 3. It hits the turret ring, jams it, and the tank turns into a blind, crippled box waiting for the second shot. The math did not include a fourth option. The shell hits, doesn't go through, and the crew lives long enough to be angry about it. At 09:14, Lucky 7 crested a low ridge lined with shattered apple trees and saw the village roofs ahead. Corporal Eddie Morales, the driver, felt the familiar surge of dread and adrenaline as the tank came out of hull-down cover and into what the training manuals called a possible engagement zone, and the crews called the killing ground. He was sweating hard enough to sting his eyes. Shermans burned. Everybody knew it. They were fast, they were simple, they were everywhere. And when a German gun found them, they had a bad habit of going up like someone had filled the hull with gasoline and bad decisions. Eddie had seen one brew up from 2 fields away. One hit, one sheet of flame out of the turret. 5 guys turned into 5 silhouettes on the inside of the armor. That image had been living in his head for 6 months. This morning, it was competing with another one. A half-crazy sergeant in grease-stained overalls, standing in a Normandy farmyard with a tape measure and a welding torch, saying, "Let me screw around with your tank for one night. If you hate it, you can yell at me after the war." The man's name was Staff Sergeant Bill Hanley, and on paper, he was nobody. Moss, 014, tank mechanic, unit, some maintenance company whose number everyone forgot as soon as they read it. He didn't command tanks. He didn't plan operations. Officially, his job was to keep other people's steel nightmares running, not to redesign them. Unofficially, he had 2 dangerous traits. He paid attention, and he took things personally. By July 44, he'd worked on enough burned-out Shermans to know their insides the way a butcher knows bones. He'd crawled into blackened hulls that still stank of cooked paint, and worse, tracing the path of armor-piercing shells with his hands. Here it punched through. Here it shattered the ready racks. Here the ammo cooked off and turned the turret into a pressure cooker. The officers talked about armor thickness and sloping plates. Bill looked at where the fires started. 9 times out of 10, it wasn't the initial hole that killed the crew. It was what the shell hit after it came through. Powder bags, loose shells, fuel lines, dry, hot, unprotected storage that turned one lucky shot into an internal volcano. The Sherman's ammunition racks were lined with thin sheet metal and hope. Hope didn't stop fragments. The first time Bill said, "We could fix this," his buddy in the motor pool laughed. "Sure, Sarge. And maybe we'll put wings on 'em next and fly to Berlin." Bill didn't smile. "I'm serious, Frank. We don't need to stop the shell. We just need to stop what it does after it gets in." He tapped the side of a burned-out hull with a wrench. Right now, a hit here turns the ammo racks into a bonfire. What if the racks didn't behave like dry wood? What if they behaved like a bucket of water? Frank squinted at him. "Water? Or anything wet, dense, and boring," Bill said. "Your ma ever tell you why they put sand around campfires?" "Yeah, so we wouldn't burn the forest down." "Exactly. He pointed inside the wreck. "This thing is a forest. We're driving around with 100 little trunks of powder and steel just waiting for a spark. I want the inside to behave like a beach." The idea was stupid enough that it might work, and simple enough that the Army hadn't thought of it. Bill's hack came in two parts. Part 1. Stop storing ammo like a pyromaniac. Instead of lining shells up in dry racks along the hull sides, he wanted to move as many as possible down into the floor, in armored bins surrounded by something. Water, glycol, mud, sand. He didn't care, as long as it was thick and wet and annoying for fire. His fantasy version involved purpose-built, double-walled containers with proper seals and valves. His war version involved whatever he could scrounge behind the lines in France. Jerry cans, fuel drums cut in half, stripped boiler tanks from a wrecked French factory, anything that could be welded into a watertight coffin around a stack of shells. If a fragment tore through and hit the ammo, he wanted it to pass through a few inches of liquid first, losing energy and heat, and then hit a shell that wasn't sitting in an oven-dry metal tray. Part 2. Lie to German gunners. Most Panther and Panzer IV crews he'd overheard prisoners talk about had a simple mental diagram of a Sherman's weak spots: low front plate, sides, turret ring. They aimed there because that's where the flat armor was thin, and where hits tended to make American tanks do the Roman candle trick. Bill couldn't change the thickness of the steel. He could change what was behind it. "If they're gonna aim here," he'd told Eddie in the farmyard, slapping the low glacis plate above the driver's head, "I want what's behind it to be something cheap and stupid." "What, like you?" Eddie had said. "Exactly," Bill grinned. "Me, sand, spare track links, concrete, whatever. Anything that's not fuel or ammo or your legs." He wanted to bolt spare track links and welded on boxes full of sand and concrete onto the spots the Germans loved to hit, not to make the tank invincible, just to turn one shot and you're a torch into one shot that knocks your teeth out and gives you 10 seconds to back the hell up. 10 seconds was the difference between a burned-out hull with 5 bodies inside and a battered tank crew standing in a ditch, swearing about lucky bastards. It should have been impossible to implement. There were regulations. There were weight limits. There were very serious men in very clean uniforms whose job it was to make sure nobody in the field tampered with the standard design. Bill had 2 advantages. 1. The front was a long way from any regulation office. 2. He was willing to work while everyone else was asleep. On July 29th, Lucky 7 rolled into the orchard that served as the battalion's lager that night, streaked with dust and sweat and bits of Normandy. Eddie had barely killed the engine when Bill appeared like a friendly grease-stained ghost. "You still want to live past 30?" he asked, climbing onto the hull without waiting for an invitation. Eddie stuck his head out of the driver's hatch. "Depends," he said. "You offering me a transfer to the infantry?" Bill dangled an empty jerry can in front of his face. "Better," he said. "I'm offering you a stupid idea with a welding torch." They worked till 2 in the morning. While most of the battalion slept in foxholes or under canvas, Bill and his small gang of maniacs turned Lucky 7 into something that would have made a quartermaster faint. They ripped out 2 of the side racks and relocated as many shells as possible into floor bins, padding the space around them with water-filled containers and whatever else they could seal. They bolted spare track links in thick, ugly curtains over the lower glacis. They welded on 2 big square boxes scavenged from a wrecked truck, filled them with a disgusting slurry of sand, mud, and broken brick, and fixed them to the spots Bill's autopsies had shown were favorite entry points. By the time they were done, Lucky 7 looked like it was cosplaying as its own junkyard. The turret still turned. The suspension still complained, but didn't quite quit. The engine still started. Eddie climbed back into the driver's hole at 0211, smelling like burned insulation and wet sand. "You sure this isn't just making us heavier targets?" he'd asked. Bill wiped sweat and grime off his forehead with the back of his hand. "No," he said. "I'm not sure of anything. But I'd rather you roll into the next fight carrying 2 tons of my garbage than 2 racks worth of dry ammo lining your ribs. Call it superstition with math." The platoon commander had not been thrilled the next morning. "Sergeant, what the hell have you done to my tank?" Bill had given him the short version. "Sir, I've made it uglier and, with luck, harder to turn into a funeral pyre. If it offends regulations, I'll write you a very apologetic letter after we don't die." The lieutenant had opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. He'd seen the same burned-out hulks Bill had. He'd written letters home that began with, "I regret to inform you." "Fine," he'd said at last. "But if we get stuck in the first patch of mud, I'm blaming your sandboxes." Now, on August 7th, Eddie was very aware of every kilogram of Bill's insurance as Lucky 7 rumbled into the open. He could feel the tank's extra weight in the way it wallowed, the way the suspension hissed. Through his narrow driver's slit, he saw the empty field ahead and the first houses of the village beyond. He did not see the Panzer IV hull down behind a half-collapsed stone wall at the far end. The German gunner saw him. Range, 800 yards. Silhouette, tall, boxy, familiar. Sherman. The German had been told, in briefings and in bloody practice, that if you hit an American tank in the lower front plate at that range, it died. He aimed where the diagrams had told him to. He breathed out. He squeezed. Eddie didn't hear the shot. He felt it. For 1 second, the world became nothing but impact. The front of the tank jumped like it had hit an invisible wall. His teeth slammed together hard enough to make him see white. Somewhere above him, the gunner yelled a wordless curse as his sight picture vanished. The interior lights flickered. Dust rained down from every seam. Eddie's forehead hit the periscope guard so hard he saw stars. He smelled dust, hot metal, wet sand, not gasoline, not burning paint, no whoosh of instant flame, no roaring dragon breath blasting up through the turret. "Hit front," the loader shouted, voice high and tight. "No penetration." Eddie realized, with a slow, stupid shock, that he was still driving. His hands were welded to the levers. The engine was still growling. The tank was still moving forward. He was alive. So were the others. "Back us off the ridge," the lieutenant barked. "Now, Morales." Eddie threw the transmission into reverse. Lucky 7 lurched backward, hull shuddering, sand and brick dust pouring from the busted cheat boxes that Bill had welded to the glasses. A second German round hit a moment later, slightly higher, where spare track links hung in ugly skirts. Another tremendous slam. Another shower of debris inside. Still no fire. Still no screaming. The tank dropped back behind the crest, out of the Panzer's line of sight, engines howling, crew yelling all at once and all on top of each other. "What the hell was that?" the gunner gasped. "That," Eddie said, half laughing, half on the edge of throwing up, "was Hanley's junkyard taking 2 for us." When they stopped, hearts pounding, the lieutenant popped his hatch took one look at the front of his tank, and started laughing like a lunatic. The lower glacis looked like someone had tried to eat it. One of the welded-on boxes had been ripped open, vomiting sand and slime. Track links were bent, cracked, hanging by one bolt. The actual armor plate underneath was dented, spider-webbed, but whole. 2 hits, he shouted down. 800 yards, no penetration. Hanley's a bloody warlock. Word spread fast. By evening, half the platoon was asking Bill how much mud and junk he needed to curse-proof their own hulls. By the end of the week, the battalion CO was pretending not to see the growing number of Shermans rolling out with homemade Hanley kits slung over their noses and flanks. Bill just kept his head down and his welding torch hot. He knew one thing the others didn't. They'd been lucky. 2 hits were still just 2 data points. The next fight might be different. The next shell might find a gap. If he wanted anyone in Washington to take this seriously, if he wanted this to be more than a weird field superstition, he needed more than a lucky anecdote. He needed numbers. He needed proof. Which was why, 3 days later, he found himself standing in front of a colonel with a clipboard, saying the sort of sentence that got engineers shot or promoted, depending on the war. "Sir, I'd like permission to shoot our own tank. On purpose." The colonel stared at Hanley like he'd just asked permission to marry the regimental mascot. "You want to what?" Bill didn't flinch. "Sir, I want to shoot one of our own tanks," he said. "On purpose. With our own gun. At our own plates. With my junk bolted on. Then I want to do it again, without the junk. And I want someone with brass on their hat to watch. So when I'm done saying, 'This works,' I'm not just some motor pool crackpot." Behind him, the lieutenant from Lucky 7 stood very still, as if hoping the floor might swallow him. The colonel looked from Bill to the lieutenant, to the paperwork on his clipboard, and back. "You realize," he said slowly, "that ordnance will have a fit if I sign off on this." "Yes, sir," Bill said. "But if we wait for ordnance, we'll be short a few tank crews by the time they stop fitting. I'd rather dent a hull on our own range than watch another one turn into a bonfire for free." The colonel's jaw worked. He was not a stupid man. He'd seen the same burned-out Shermans. He'd read the same casualty reports with those quiet little notes. Tank disabled by single hit. Ammunition exploded. No survivors. He'd also seen Lucky 7 roll back behind the ridge that morning with its nose chewed up, and its crew still swearing instead of screaming. "You really think your sandboxes did that?" he said. Bill didn't pretend to be modest. "Yes, sir. I think 2 German gunners just wrote us a recommendation letter in high explosive." Silence stretched. Somewhere outside, a truck backfired. Finally, the colonel sighed. "Fine," he said. "You get 1 range, 1 tank, 1 afternoon. You shoot it in front of me, my staff, and whoever else I drag along. If all you do is make an expensive mess, I will personally see to it that you spend the rest of the war changing oil. Clear?" "Yes, sir." "And Hanley?" "Sir?" "If this works," the colonel said, "ordnance is going to hate you. A lot." Bill gave a small, tired grin. "With respect, sir," he said, "they can stand in line." They took a Sherman that was already halfway to retirement. Dog 9 had thrown a track twice, lost a transmission once, and had a turret that stuck whenever you tried to traverse too fast. Nobody was going to cry if she ended up uglier. By noon the next day, she sat at the edge of a makeshift range, a strip of flattened field backed by an earthen berm. Forward, at exactly 500 yards, engineers had sunk a row of white-painted stakes. The target. Bill had split Dog Nine's front end down the middle like a butcher doing a demonstration. Left half, as close to factory standard as a battle-scarred Sherman could get. Right half, Hanley kit. Spare track links welded in ugly layers. A box full of sand and broken brick bolted onto the lower glacis. Extra plates where he could steal them. Inside, same story. On the untouched side, ammo racks as issued. Thin metal, dry, shells sitting in neat little rows like teeth. On the Hanley side, armored bins sunk floor deep. Shells surrounded by cans and compartments full of water, mud, and whatever else he'd bullied the engineers into giving him. He'd even painted a thin white line down the middle of the hull and turret. This side mine, this side yours. Subtle as always, the colonel muttered when he saw it. Didn't want anyone getting confused later, sir, Bill said. Behind a low earthwork 100 yards back, a 76mm gun crew stood ready. The colonel had wanted to borrow a German 75 from an armory for realism. They hadn't had one handy. Bill had shrugged. Steel doesn't care who made the shell, sir, he'd said. If our own gun can't kill it, the paperwork will scream louder anyway. The first shot went to the untouched side. The colonel insisted. No sorcery until we've seen what normal looks like, he said. Dog 9 sat there in the sun, empty and indifferent. Bill stood with his notebook out, feeling sweat trickle down his spine. The colonel raised a hand. Gun crew, ready. Ready, sir? Target, left front plate, marker stake, L2. Fire when ready. The 76mm cracked. The shot looked slow from a distance, a lazy streak across air, then hit like a god's hammer. The shell struck just above the driver's position on the bare glacis. A puff of dust and paint burst off the front of the Sherman. Half a heartbeat later, flame spat out of the empty turret ring like a giant exhaling. The observers flinched anyway, even though they knew there was nobody inside. When the smoke cleared, there was a fist-sized hole in the front plate you could see daylight through. At the colonel's signal, they clambered up the hull and dropped inside. The interior looked exactly like Bill knew it would. Fragments had scythed through the ammo racks, shredding cases and gouging neat, vicious metal lines along the hull side. One shell had split clean in two, its powder spilling like torn bread. So that's one shot, the colonel said quietly. No Hanley, no crew, no tank. Bill didn't answer. He didn't need to. They all knew this picture. They'd all seen the version with charred shapes instead of dust. Second shot, right side, Hanley side, same range, same angle. The only change was a few degrees on the traverse wheel. Gun crew, ready. Ready. Target, right front, stake R2, fire. The 76 roared again. This time, everyone watched the sandboxes. The shell hit almost exactly where Bill had chalked a circle the night before. For a split second, the front of the tank exploded in a dirty blossom. Sand, mud, water, shattered brick. A gout of disgusting slurry burst outward and upward, splattering the ground, the hull, and two unlucky junior officers who had picked the wrong part of the berm to peek over. There was no bright flash, no tall flame jet. When the dust settled, the front of the tank looked like it had been mugged, not murdered. The sand-filled box was a torn-open wound. The track links welded over the glacis were bent and broken, some sheared clean off. Underneath, the armor plate was dented inward, a spiderweb of hairline fractures radiating from a shallow crater. But there was no hole. Inside, when they climbed down, there were fragments on the floor. Chunks of brick, twisted bits of track, shards of shell. The nearest ammo bin on that side had a jagged scar across its outer wall. Inside the bin, the shells sat in filthy, lukewarm water and mud, harmless and sulking. Wouldn't want to eat off it, Bill said. But I'd bet my next pay packet the crew walks away. The colonel didn't smile. He just stared at the deformed plate, then at the bin, then at the mess on the floor. How many hits do you think this abomination takes before we get a cook-off? He asked. Bill shrugged. Sir, that's why you brought more shells. They kept shooting. 3 more rounds at the normal side. Lower plate, corner, edge of the driver's hatch. By the third, the left half of Dog 9 looked like a peeled tin can. On the Hanley side, they took it step by step. 1 into the already wounded glacis, 1 into the welded track skirt above it, 1 just off the center line, where his improvised armor thinned out. Every time, the tank jumped, belched mud and dust, rang like a funeral bell. Every time, the plate behind his junk looked worse on the outside and stubbornly intact on the inside. After the 5th hit, one of the floor bins had sprung a leak, dribbling sandy water onto the hull bottom. Still no fire, the colonel muttered. Sir, if this thing was full of crew and gasoline, one of the lieutenants said quietly, we'd be listening to them swear right now, not smelling them. By the 7th hit, the gun crew's shoulders ached and ears rang. Sir, the gun chief said, if this was a real tank, this would be one incredibly pissed-off Sherman. Light laughter rippled along the berm. Nervous, but real. Bill wasn't laughing. He was counting. Hits, angles, spall patterns. Every new crater on his side meant his hack wasn't a fluke over one lucky morning. It was becoming data. That night, the colonel didn't write a cordial note to ordnance. He wrote something closer to a threat. Field test, 76 nm VS, modified M4A1. Hanley configuration. Control hits, unmodified side. 3 rounds, 500 YDS, glacis. Complete penetration, ammunition compromised after first hit. Modified hits, sandbox track configuration, wet ammo bins. 7 rounds, or 500 YDS. Varied impact points. No complete penetration observed on modified sections. No ammunition cook-off. Recommend immediate investigation and adoption of similar protective measures. Failure to do so will, in my view, contribute directly to unnecessary casualties. He underlined that last clause hard enough to tear the paper. Then he added a second packet. Photographs. Left side, neat hole, charred paint, shredded racks. Right side, bent tracks, torn boxes, muddy interior. No scorch marks. At the bottom, he stapled a short, angry note. This is the same tank. Ordnance, predictably, did not write back with flowers. They wrote with delay. Requests for further controlled trials under supervision. Concerns about vehicle mobility given additional weight. Polite suggestions that field units refrain from unauthorized modifications pending doctrinal review. Bill read one such memo, smudged from travel, propped against a crate of spare parts, and snorted. Yeah, he muttered. I'll make sure to tell the Panzers to stop shooting us until everyone's comfortable. The colonel's official answer was more diplomatic. His unofficial answer was a shrug and 4 words. Keep welding, Sergeant Hanley. By September, half the battalion's Shermans wore some variation of his junk armor. Some just had extra track links. Others sported full-on sand coffins bolted to their noses, sides, and turrets. Inside, any space that could be safely spared from crew knees and tools was given over to wet bins, jerry cans, and jury-rigged tanks sloshing around shells. They were heavier. They were uglier. They also stopped dying quite so fast. The real verdict didn't come from memos. It came in October, east of the German border, when the battalion walked into an ambush that should have been a massacre. The road pinched between a low ridge and a village. Everyone knew it was a bad place. They went anyway, because orders and maps didn't care about bad places. 3 Panthers were waiting, hull down, guns laid on the kill zone. The first American tank into the choke point wasn't Lucky 7. It was Baker 4, another Hanley special with more weld scars than original paint. The German gunner saw exactly what he'd been trained to see. Tall silhouette, thin-looking armor, Sherman, range, 600 yards. He fired where the diagram said to, low front plate. Inside Baker 4, the crew had just enough time to feel that familiar, stomach-clenching hit. The tank kicked. Every loose item in the hull went airborne for a fraction of a second. Somebody's helmet smacked the radio. Sand and mud vomited through a fresh crack in one of the front boxes, splattering the driver and co-driver with wet grit. No flash. No fire. The driver shoved the lever, trying to back them out of the trap. Second hit. Same place, or close enough that the armor groaned in protest. The hull came up off the bogies a centimeter and slammed back down. Still no fire. Hanley's junk is holding, the loader yelled, half hysterical. It's holding. Third hit. Slightly higher this time, right where the normal racks would have lined the hull side with dry, shell-thin kindling. The Panther gunner had decided to walk his aim up, the way he always did when the first 2 rounds made a Sherman twitch, but not light. Inside Baker 4, the third impact felt like a train ramming a shack. The turret jammed at 10 degrees off-center. The co-driver swore that his toes were now 2 inches shorter. The ammo on that side? Soaked. A few fragments punched through the inner wall of the bin, tore shallow gouges in 2 shell casings, and died hissing in cold, filthy water. The loader looked down, expecting hell. He saw mud. He started laughing, high and wild. 3 hits, he shouted. 3 hits. We're still here. The lieutenant in the commander's seat did not feel nearly as festive. He couldn't turn the turret. His driver was half blind from flying sand, and somewhere ahead, 3 Panthers were still doing their best to erase them. Pop smoke, he yelled. Driver, get us into that ditch. Gunner, as soon as you see anything that looks like German paint, you send him something back. Baker 4 lurched off the road, belching smoke, alive purely on the strength of one mechanic's ugly welds and cheap fluid. Panther rounds kept coming, chewing at the ridge, the ditch, anything that stuck out. They killed 2 Shermans that day. Old ones, unmodified, the last clean hulls in the battalion. The Hanley specials came back limping, bruised, half deaf. Their casualty lists looked very different. 2 killed, 7 wounded, and an obscene number of phrases underlined in debriefs. Hit 3 times front, no fire. Ammo bins compromised but did not ignite. Crew bailed out under own power. A week later, an ordnance major from some rear area board arrived in a jeep, clutching a sheaf of forms and looking as if someone had told him the law of gravity was under review. He walked around Baker 4, stared at the chewed-up glasses, poked at the torn sandboxes with the tip of his pen. Sergeant Hanley, he said eventually, this is not regulation. No, sir, Bill said. Regulation was getting people killed. The major squinted at the cracked but unburned ammo bins. How much extra weight are we talking? Enough to make the springs complain, Bill said. Not enough to matter if the other choice is cremation. The major exhaled through his nose. Headquarters is already working on improved ammunition stowage designs, he said. Proper wet racks, internal tanks, tested, approved. Bill shrugged. Good, he said. then maybe one day they won't have to copy this garbage. But until your proper solution gets here, my guys want my garbage." The major looked at the hit marks again. He wasn't a front-line man, but even from the rear, you could read a story carved into steel. 3 hits in the front arc, no penetration into the crew space, scorching and spall, where, in a clean Sherman, there would have been a torch. He made a small, unhappy note on his clipboard. "Unofficially," he said, low enough that only Bill and the colonel heard. "If my boys were up there, I'd tell them to carry as much sand and scrap as they could weld on." "Officially?" the colonel asked. "Officially," the major said, straightening up. "I will write that field units displayed commendable initiative in adopting interim protective measures pending the arrival of approved modifications." Which, in bureaucratic, meant, "You were right. We're late. Don't stop." The war moved on. Factories back in the States began turning out Shermans with proper wet ammunition stowage, double-walled bins around the racks, integral water jackets, real engineering instead of jerry cans and foul mud. Some of those ideas came from lab studies. Some came from reports. Some came from photographs of Dog 9 and Baker 4, and a dozen other tanks that should have been funeral pyres, and instead were just ugly. Hanley never saw his name on any design. In the manuals and staff histories written later, the change would get one polite sentence. Field experience in Normandy prompted the introduction of improved ammunition stowage arrangements, greatly reducing the incidence of catastrophic fires in M4 series tanks. That was one way to say it. The crews had another. They called the early mods Hanley kits. They called the factory ones the good racks. And they told the story, over mess tables and in foxholes and later in VFW halls, of the mechanic who'd walked into a colonel's tent and said, "Sir, I'd like to shoot our own tank." Years later, a museum guide in a clean shirt would tap a Sherman's hull and recite the curated version to bored tourists. Early Shermans had dry ammunition stowage and were prone to burning. Later models used wet stowage and additional applique armor, which significantly improved crew survivability. If you stood very still and listened past the brochure tone, you could almost hear the real chapter under it. The clang of a test shell hitting Dog 9's unprotected hull and turning the interior into shredded metal. The wet, ugly splat of another shell dying in a box of sand and junk. The way Baker 4 hit 3 times in all the right places, backed out of a kill zone, coughing smoke and profanity instead of flame. Somewhere in those unrecorded sounds lived one simple, dirty idea. If you can't make the armor perfect, make the inside boring. Turn forests into beaches. Turn Roman candles into dented, muddy miracles. If you were to write it the way a thumbnail would, years later, it would sound dramatic, almost stupid. How one tank mechanic's insane armor hack-let Sherman survive 3 direct hits. Bill Hanley would have rolled his eyes at the capitalization. Then he'd have gone back to welding track links on some kid's hull and telling him, "Don't thank me yet. Thank me when you're swearing in a ditch instead of burning in a field."